The air along the coast of Hakata Bay smelled different in the autumn of 1274. Fishermen who had worked these waters their entire lives noticed it first: a tension in the wind, an unnatural stillness in the rhythm of the tides. By October, the rumors that had circulated through the port towns of Kyushu for months solidified into terrifying reality. The Mongol Empire, which had conquered half the known world, had set its sights on Japan. For the common people of the islands, farmers tending their paddies, merchants loading their boats, temple monks copying sutras, the invasion would not be a distant abstraction debated in the halls of Kamakura. It would be a visceral, immediate test of survival, one that demanded every ounce of ingenuity their society had cultivated over centuries. The Japanese archipelago in the 13th century was a nation organized around the principle of preparedness, though not for an enemy of this magnitude. The Kamakura shogunate, established less than a century earlier, had created a military government built on the backs of the samurai class, warriors bound by oaths of loyalty to their lords and sustained by the rice produced on their estates. But the social machinery that kept this world functioning extended far beyond the battlefield. The peasant farmers who worked the terraced fields, the artisans who forged tools and weapons, the merchants who moved goods between provinces, and the Buddhist monasteries that served as centers of learning and charity. These were the invisible infrastructure that would determine whether Japan could withstand the Mongol onslaught. For when the first wave of invasion ships appeared on the horizon in November 1274, carrying an estimated 23,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean soldiers, the entire coastal population of Kyushu faced a choice that would echo through generations: flee inland and abandon everything, or stand and defend a homeland they had never imagined could be threatened. The Mongols did not arrive as a mindless horde. They came as a machine of conquest, refined through decades of warfare across Asia and Europe. Their fleet, constructed in the shipyards of Korea under the coercion of Kublai Khan, consisted of hundreds of vessels designed for amphibious assault. The ships carried not just soldiers, but siege equipment, horses, and supplies for sustained operations. More terrifyingly, they brought weapons that Japanese defenders had never encountered: explosive projectiles launched from catapults, tubes packed with gunpowder that created thunderous noise and lethal shrapnel. When these bombs detonated on the beaches of Hakata, the psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. Japanese warriors, trained in the ritualized combat of mounted archery and single combat, found themselves facing disciplined units that moved in coordinated formations, raining arrows in synchronized volleys that turned the sky dark. For the civilian population caught in the invasion zone, the first hours were defined by chaos. The Mongols made landfall at multiple points along the coast, overwhelming the small garrisons stationed at fishing villages and port facilities. The standard defensive strategy of the time relied on samurai warriors rushing to meet threats, but the speed and scale of the Mongol assault rendered traditional responses inadequate. Villages that stood directly in the path of the invasion force were given no quarter. The Mongol military doctrine, perfected through campaigns in China and Persia, viewed terror as a strategic asset. Reports from survivors, recorded later by Buddhist monks and shogunate officials, describe systematic destruction. Wooden houses were set ablaze, fishing boats were smashed, and food stores were either seized or destroyed. The Mongols understood that an island nation depended on its coastal infrastructure for survival. By targeting ports, granaries, and fishing fleets, they aimed to cripple Japan's ability to sustain resistance. But the Japanese social structure, for all its rigidity, possessed a flexibility born of necessity. The farming communities of Kyushu lived under the constant threat of typhoons, earthquakes, and crop failure. They had developed communal systems for rapid evacuation and resource preservation that now proved invaluable. When warning bells rang from temple towers, a network of communication that predated the invasion by centuries, families knew exactly what to do. Rice stores were immediately buried in sealed ceramic jars in hidden locations. Valuables were concealed in false floors or carried to caves in the mountains. Livestock were driven inland to designated safe zones, often on land owned by temples that had long served as sanctuaries during local conflicts. This was not improvisation. It was the execution of practiced emergency protocols that had been refined through generations of living on the edge of disaster. The role of Buddhist temples during the invasion cannot be overstated. These institutions functioned as far more than spiritual centers. They were landlords, administrators, hospitals, and repositories of knowledge. The larger temples maintained their own armed monk militias, warrior clergy who had fought in the religious conflicts of the previous century and knew how to wield a naginata or draw a bow. When refugees flooded inland from the coastal zones, temples opened their gates and organized relief efforts with the efficiency of a modern aid organization. Monks distributed rice from temple granaries, provided medical care using herbal remedies documented in Chinese medical texts, and served as scribes to record the names of the displaced so families could locate one another. The temples also became intelligence centers. Monks traveling between religious sites carried messages about Mongol movements, troop strengths, and defensive needs, creating an information network that the shogunate desperately needed. The samurai warriors who bore the brunt of the fighting discovered that their traditional mode of warfare was lethally inadequate. Japanese combat doctrine of the 13th century was rooted in individual valor. A samurai would announce his name and lineage before engaging an opponent in single combat, a ritual that demonstrated honor and earned glory for his family. The Mongols, products of a military culture that prioritized victory over ceremony, had no interest in such formalities. They fought as units, were using archers to lay down suppressive fire while cavalry units maneuvered to flank and encircle. Their composite bows, shorter and more powerful than Japanese yari, could penetrate armor at ranges where Japanese arrows fell short. The leather lamellar armor worn by Mongol heavy cavalry was lighter and more flexible than the elaborate oyoroi suits of Japanese warriors, allowing for greater mobility in close-quarters combat. The samurai adapted, but adaptation required abandoning cherished traditions. Warriors began fighting in groups rather than seeking individual duels. Archers positioned themselves behind hastily constructed earthworks and palisades rather than charging into the open. The psychological toll of this shift was profound. For men raised to view battlefield glory as the highest achievement, being forced to adopt defensive, so collective tactics felt like a betrayal of everything their class represented. Yet survival demanded it. The initial engagements of the 1274 invasion were catastrophic for Japanese forces, precisely because commanders insisted on traditional methods. Only after suffering devastating losses did the warriors of Kyushu begin coordinating their movements, sharing intelligence, and constructing fortifications that could withstand Mongol siege weapons. The civilian population played a role in defense that has been largely overlooked by histories focused on samurai exploits. Farmers and laborers were conscripted to dig defensive trenches along likely invasion routes, massive earthworks that still scar the landscape of northern Kyushu today. These barriers, some reaching 3 meters in height and extending for kilometers, were not sophisticated military engineering, but they didn't need to be. They served to slow the Mongol advance, forcing cavalry to dismount and infantry to bunch together, creating choke points where Japanese defenders could concentrate their limited forces. The construction of these fortifications was a monumental undertaking, accomplished in a matter of weeks by thousands of workers who received no payment and little recognition. They labored, knowing that their villages, their families, and their entire way of life depended on buying time for the shogunate to organize a coherent defense. The economic strain of the invasion was immediate and severe. The Kamakura shogunate operated on a fragile fiscal model. Samurai warriors were not salaried soldiers, but landholders who owed military service in exchange for their estates. When war came, they were expected to equip themselves and their retainers at their own expense. The problem was that most samurai, even those of considerable status, lived modestly. Their wealth was tied up in rice land, not liquid capital. A typical provincial warrior might have enough resources to maintain his armor, weapons, and a small household, but mounting a sustained military campaign required resources far beyond what individual samurai could provide. The shogunate promised rewards, land grants from conquered territories, But there were no conquered territories. This was a defensive war, and victory would bring no plunder, only the preservation of what already existed. For the merchant class, the invasion created both opportunity and peril. The sudden demand for weapons, armor, arrows, and military supplies sent prices soaring. Smiths who forged farming tools found themselves working day and night to produce spearheads and arrowheads. Tanners who normally supplied leather for sandals and bags were pressed into service making armor components. Rice merchants saw their inventories requisitioned by military officials, sometimes with promises of future payment, sometimes with none at all. The port cities that normally thrived on trade with China and Korea saw their commercial networks collapse. No merchant was willing to risk the sea routes while Mongol fleets prowled the waters. The economic isolation was suffocating, a reminder of how dependent Japan had become on continental trade for luxuries, advanced technologies, and even basic goods like iron and quality steel. Then came the storm. In the midst of the fighting, as the Mongols consolidated their beachhead and prepared for a deeper push inland, the weather turned. What began as heavy rain escalated into a typhoon, one of the massive tropical cyclones that form in the western Pacific and occasionally strike Japan with catastrophic force. For the Mongol fleet, anchored in Hakata Bay and the surrounding waters, the storm was apocalyptic. The ships, many of them hastily constructed and overloaded with troops, horses, and supplies, were not built to withstand such conditions. Accounts describe vessels smashing into one another in the darkness, hulls splintering against the rocky coastline, and thousands of soldiers drowning as the sea swallowed entire sections of the fleet. By the time the storm passed, the invasion force was shattered. The surviving Mongols, stranded and demoralized, so withdrew to their damaged ships and retreated to Korea. The Japanese interpreted the storm as divine intervention. The term kamikaze, meaning divine wind, was coined to describe this meteorological salvation. Shinto priests and Buddhist monks proclaimed that the gods had protected Japan, that the prayers offered at shrines and temples across the nation had summoned supernatural forces to repel the foreign invaders. This religious narrative was not merely propaganda. It reflected a genuine belief system. The people of 13th century Japan lived in a world where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was porous. Storms, earthquakes, and plagues were not random events, but manifestations of spiritual forces. The timing of the typhoon, arriving at the moment of greatest peril, seemed incontrovertible proof of divine favor. But the respite was temporary. Kublai Khan, humiliated by the failure of his first invasion, began preparations for a second, far larger assault. Over the next 6 years, the Mongol Empire marshaled resources on an unprecedented scale. Shipyards in China and Korea were expanded to produce a massive fleet. Soldiers were recruited from across the empire, not just Mongols, but Chinese infantry, Korean auxiliaries, and even contingents from Central Asia. The logistical challenge of assembling and supplying an invasion force of over 100,000 men and 4,000 ships was staggering, a demonstration of the Mongol Empire's organizational capacity. In Japan, the intervening years were spent in feverish preparation. The shogunate, recognizing that luck alone would not save them a second time, undertook a comprehensive militarization of Kyushu. The stone walls built along the coast after the first invasion were expanded and reinforced, creating a continuous defensive barrier that stretched for kilometers. These fortifications, constructed primarily of large stones mortared together, were designed to prevent ships from making easy landfall and to provide cover for defending archers. The scale of the construction effort was immense, requiring the labor of tens of thousands of workers drawn from across western Japan. Samurai who owned estates near the coast were ordered to contribute both money and manpower to the project, a financial burden that pushed many families to the brink of ruin. The civilian population endured the preparation years under conditions of constant tension. Farming villages near the coast were required to maintain evacuation plans and conduct regular drills. Temple bells that once called the faithful to prayer now doubled as warning systems, with standardized signals to indicate different threats, one pattern for fire, another for invasion, another for natural disaster. Granaries were stockpiled not just with rice for immediate consumption, but with seed rice that could be planted if the agricultural cycle were disrupted. The concept of strategic reserves, already well developed in a society accustomed to periodic famine, was expanded to military scales. Provincial officials maintained detailed registries of food stores, weapons caches, and available manpower, creating a bureaucratic apparatus that could theoretically mobilize the entire society for total war. But when the second invasion came in the summer of 1281, the Mongols arrived with overwhelming force. The fleet, divided into two massive armadas launching from Korea and southern China, was the largest amphibious invasion force assembled until the modern era. But the Japanese were no longer the unprepared defenders of 7 years earlier. The stone walls channeled the Mongol landings into predetermined kill zones, where concentrated archery and spear formations could inflict maximum casualties. Small Japanese boats, manned by warriors and fishermen who knew every current and reef, harassed the Mongol fleet in nighttime raids, setting ships ablaze and creating chaos. The fighting was brutal and prolonged, lasting weeks as the Mongols struggled to establish a secure beachhead against fanatical resistance. Once again, the weather intervened, and another typhoon, even more powerful than the first, struck in August, while much of the Mongol fleet remained at sea. The destruction was total. Thousands of ships were sunk or driven onto the rocks. Tens of thousands of soldiers drowned or were stranded on hostile shores, where Japanese forces hunted them down. The second kamikaze was not a single dramatic storm, but a series of weather systems that battered the invasion fleet over several days, compounding the logistical nightmare and ultimately forcing a complete withdrawal. The survivors who made it back to Korea and China carried tales of supernatural vengeance, reinforcing the Japanese belief that their islands were protected by divine forces. The aftermath of the invasions transformed Japanese society in ways that would resonate for centuries. The Kamakura shogunate, despite successfully defending the nation, faced a crisis of legitimacy and finance. Samurai who had fought in the campaigns expected rewards, but there was no conquered land to distribute, no plunder to divide. The shogunate attempted to satisfy these demands by confiscating estates from temples and rival warrior clans, creating new grievances and internal conflicts. The financial strain of maintaining coastal defenses and supporting an enlarged military establishment became unsustainable. Within decades, the shogunate would collapse, giving way to a new era of civil war. For the common people, the invasions reinforced cultural patterns that already existed. The experience of communal defense, of villages working together to evacuate, hide resources, and support the war effort, and strengthened the bonds of mutual obligation that defined rural life. The role of temples as centers of crisis management became even more entrenched. The memory of the divine winds entered the national mythology, a story of divine protection that would be invoked again and again in moments of national peril. Most tragically in the 20th century, when desperate military leaders would send pilots on suicide missions bearing the same name. The Mongol invasions also marked a turning point in Japan's relationship with the outside world. For centuries, Japan had been an eager student of Chinese and Korean culture, importing Buddhism, writing systems, art, and administrative models. The invasions demonstrated that continental powers could pose existential threats, not just cultural opportunities. And a strand of isolationism and suspicion of foreign contact took root in Japanese consciousness, one that would shape foreign policy decisions for centuries. The experience taught that the sea was both shield and vulnerability, that insularity provided safety, but also limited options. The physical landscape of Kyushu still bears the scars of those desperate years. The stone walls that were built to repel the Mongols remain, massive constructions that testify to the scale of the defensive effort. Archaeological excavations have uncovered arrowheads, broken weapons, and the remains of ships, material evidence of the largest military crisis medieval Japan ever faced. These relics tell a story not just of samurai heroics, but of an entire society mobilized for survival, of farmers digging trenches, of merchants supplying armies, eyes of monks tending the wounded, and of communities holding together under unimaginable pressure. What emerges from the historical record is not a simple narrative of divine intervention or military prowess, but a complex portrait of resilience. The Japanese did not defeat the Mongol Empire through superior tactics or technology. They survived through a combination of geographic advantage, social cohesion, adaptive strategy, and extraordinary luck with the weather. The experience revealed both the strengths and limitations of feudal Japanese society. The rigid hierarchies and warrior culture that defined the age proved inadequate for modern warfare. Yet the underlying social infrastructure, the village networks, the temple institutions, the communal labor systems, demonstrated remarkable flexibility and endurance. The legacy of the Mongol invasions is not merely historical curiosity, it represents a foundational moment in Japanese identity, a time when the entire nation faced a common threat and discovered resources within itself that had not been tested before. The phrase kamikaze became shorthand for miraculous salvation, but the real miracle was human, the miracle of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of a society finding the collective will to resist when surrender might have seemed the rational choice. In the end, Japan survived not because the gods intervened, but because its people, from the highest samurai to the lowest peasant, refused to accept conquest as inevitable. They endured, they adapted, and they persevered, passing down to future generations a legacy of resilience that would be tested again and again throughout the turbulent centuries to come.